And speaking of the Lions, it's now time for Overreaction Monday as we get you set for some of the players who have been struggling. To join us now, it's our buddy Chris Towers, and let's start right there with the Lions, Heath, because TJ Hockenson has been struggling. His last 2 games, 11 targets, 6 catches, 64 yards, no touchdowns. Last 3 games, essentially, it's been really bad. So what do we do about TJ Hockenson? Is it time to move on to Dawson Knox, to Dalton Schultz, if you pick those guys up, or is it time to maybe just move on from TJ Hockenson altogether?
Yeah, the problem is that I didn't pick those guys up where I had TJ Hockenson because I thought he'd be just fine. If I had both those guys in my lineup, I'd probably be starting Knox or Schultz this week. But it just kind of looks like TJ Hockenson is what he was last year, which is still probably a starting tight end over the rest of the year. He just hasn't got the huge volume boost we were hoping for. It would help him a lot, I think, if Mon-Fri St. Brown were to emerge as a number 1 wide receiver and start getting 8 to 10 targets regularly. Then maybe the defense wouldn't pay so much attention to Hockenson. I don't think there's anyone besides maybe Knox who's going to be available in a third of leagues that I would start over Hockenson. I'm not dropping TJ Hockenson, but I'm also not as optimistic about the rest of the season as I was coming into the year.
We'll see how he does against the Bengals in week number 6, but it has been a frustrating experience for TJ Hockenson, fantasy manager, since those first 2 weeks of the season. A.J. Brown returned in week number 5 after being out in week 4 with a hamstring injury, but he didn't return with a flurry. He almost had a touchdown, but unfortunately did not find the end zone. 6 targets, 3 catches, 38 yards. He has 1 touchdown, which came in week 1. Did have the hamstring injury, which flared up in week 3 and caused him to miss week 4. So, Chris, where's the panic level in regards to A.J. Brown?
It's so hard to answer that question not being a doctor, because for me, it really just comes down to health. It's so hard to judge what's happened so far because he dealt with that hamstring injury. It's especially hard to judge week 5. I think anytime a player comes back from an injury, the first week is always hit or miss. You never know quite whether they're back to 100%. So I think you can give a mulligan for that one. The question moving forward is coming off double knee surgery on both knees, dealing with a vague knee injury during training camp, and now having a hamstring injury in the first 4 weeks of the season. How much can you rely on A.J. Brown to be healthy moving forward? If he's healthy, I think he's one of the 4 or 5 most talented wide receivers in football, and I think he'll be a must-start fantasy option. But without knowing whether you can rely on him to be 100% moving forward, it does make it harder. I still view him as, a top 12 wide receiver moving forward, but he's got to show that he's back to 100% relatively soon.
Yep, and a very tough matchup coming up in week 6 against the Bills, and probably Tre'Davious White. And we've seen White take away some number 1 receivers, so it could be a bad scenario coming up for A.J. Brown as a starting fantasy wide receiver. So just take that into account when you're setting your lineups for week number 6. If I were to tell you, Heath, that Baker Mayfield threw 32 passes, threw for 305 yards, threw 2 touchdowns without Jarvis Landry on the field, you would have thought Odell Beckham might have had a good game. Once again, another poor performance. I know you've been down on Beckham since the start of the season. Is it time to cut Odell Beckham?
Well, I was going to say, if you told me that, I would have assumed Odell Beckham didn't play, because Baker Mayfield's much better when he throws to anybody besides Odell Beckham. I don't know why that is. It doesn't make any sense to me. But we've got 2.5 years now, 2.25 years of Odell Beckham in Cleveland, and he's basically been exactly the same player as Sterling Shepard with fewer catches. They have almost exactly the same number of yards in that stretch, same number of targets, same number of touchdowns. This is the first guy on the list that I think it's conceivable you could drop in a 10-team league because he was the worst player on your roster right now. I'm not actively trying to drop Odell Beckham. I'm not spite dropping him. You certainly can't start him, though.
It's very difficult, and again, for a Browns team that was in a shootout, essentially, a lot of it had to do with their ground attack. Might be in a shootout again against the Cardinals in week 6, so maybe Beckham bounces back. But yes, it's time to consider moving on from Beckham, especially with some of these injuries that you're dealing with, maybe to other spots on your fantasy roster. Beckham not a must-hold anymore. And you might be saying the same thing about Allen Robinson. I know we are all expecting him to bounce back at some point and play like the Allen Robinson that we know, and hopefully Justin Fields gets him going. But at what point are we going to say it's time to move on from Robinson, who just had 4 catches, 32 yards on 5 targets, has yet to eclipse 6 targets since week 1, 1 touchdown on the season? Chris, is it time to maybe consider cutting Allen Robinson in 10-team leagues as well?
It's all Matt Nagy's fault. When Matt Nagy named Justin Fields the starter last week, my reaction was, I'm cautiously optimistic that actually naming him the starter might mean that Matt Nagy will, lean into what makes Justin Fields great and, build his offense around the really special talent they have at quarterback. And then we see yesterday, it's just more of the same. He just doesn't seem to be interested in molding his offense around the player that he has. They're running a very similar offense right now with Justin Fields to what they were with Andy Dalton early on in the season before his injury. And so I just don't think that's going to maximize the potential of this offense. And I think we've seen that through 3 games. Justin Fields is a better passer than I think a lot of people give him credit for. But with a pretty, milquetoast offense, it's hard to see this team living up to its potential. And I think that includes Allen Robinson. I'm not getting rid of him. I'm not dropping him. I still have too much faith in his abilities, but you certainly can't view him as a must-start player anymore. I think he's more in the, flex or wide receiver 4 discussion, which is really disappointing for someone who had him as wide receiver 6 coming into the season overall.
Yeah, we all had high hopes for him, and again, long season, he can still turn things around, but it's got to start happening soon. And next week he gets a Packers team down Jair Alexander. Maybe he gets the Jamar Chase treatment and starts to put up those type of numbers. But at this point, just to stay in that same vein, you're starting Jamar Chase without hesitation for the next several weeks over Allen Robinson, no matter what Robinson starts to show us. Another running back, or another player at least, running back of this in this category that's been struggling is Miles Sanders. And Heath, we had him on this list last week, and you said all these glowing things about his yards after contact and what he's been doing with the ball in his hands when he's gotten the ball in his hands. And he got 11 carries against the Carolina Panthers. He got 5 catches, third week in a row, he's had at least 3 catches. But he's just not producing. Is it time to cut Miles Sanders in 10 teams?
I'm not going to cut Miles Sanders. In fact, I might make some buy low offers for Miles Sanders, and I'm going to just talk out both sides of my mouth because that's what I do. But yes, it was the efficiency last week. This week I was encouraged because he played his highest snap count yet, 75%. He had 16 touches in the game. He was really inefficient. The Panthers have a pretty good defense. They've been pretty tough against the run, except for Dallas. He still averaged 4 yards per carry. Kenneth Gainwell was basically nowhere to be found. Now, they play Tampa Bay this week on a short week. You're no chance you are using Miles Sanders, but I think there are some Miles Sanders fantasy managers out there who look at what he's done, look at this matchup, and you might get him dirt cheap. The next 3 games after this week, the Raiders, the Lions, the Chargers, as long as he keeps this type of participation, we'll get the production against those defenses.
All right, hopefully Nick Sirianni gives him double digits in carries because that's been a problem for him. First time since week 1 that we saw that, so hopefully that's a sign of things to come. But yes, probably going to struggle running the ball at least against the Tampa Bay defense on Thursday night. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to see Trey Sermon run the ball very much anytime soon because after Elijah Mitchell came back in week number 5, it was Mitchell 9 carries for 43 yards, Trey Sermon 1 carry for 7 yards. So for a guy that started to trend in the right direction, Chris, we saw Mitchell come back and basically they told us he's the guy. So are we cutting Trey Sermon now? Maybe not just in 10-team leagues, but in 12-team leagues as well.
Yeah, I mean they're on the 49ers are on a bye this week too, so it might be easier than ever to drop Trey Sermon. I'm not saying he needs to be dropped, but you do have Jermichael Hasty and Jeff Wilson who are at least eligible to come back from their injuries in week 7, so it'll be worth keeping an eye on any updates on those. I haven't seen any indications either way on them lately, but if those guys are back, I mean, we saw it. It took every other running back on the roster getting hurt for Trey Sermon to even get a carry this season. I think the revealed preferences for the 49ers speak to how they view him, which is they just don't think he's as good as they did when they drafted him or as good as we hoped he would be. So, yeah, I think he is droppable.
Just a frustrating situation. We like to see players that we had high expectations for doing things, and right now they're not. Guys like Hockenson, A.J. Brown, Beckham, Robinson, Sanders, Sermon. This is why we're reacting to it. In some cases, you guys are overreacting to it. So you don't have to drop them all, but as we told you, you could drop some of them. Sermon for sure, Beckham probably for sure as well. 10-team leagues, not 12-team leagues. Don't completely overreact, but it's okay to react if you have to make some other decisions on your fantasy rosters. Want more of the Fantasy Football Today podcast and nonstop year-round fantasy advice? It's simple. Hit the subscribe button and hang with us all throughout the year.